It is March 4th, 1995, and my brother Chris and I are visiting the Yerba Buena Gardens in San Francisco to visit an exhibit called The Art of Star Wars. This video is made up of footage I shot on my Sony Hi8 camera back in the day, and at the time it was quite technologically advanced. This was actually my third trip to the exhibit, and I made a decision to document as much of it as possible. And it's interesting to look back on this and sort of frame it in the context of where we were in that time of fandom. At the time, this was a very mind-blowing exhibit because these were things that I had only seen previously in books and magazines, and of course the movies themselves. So what I'm going to do during this video is not really speak to what's being shown on screen, because if you're watching this, you probably recognize a lot of this stuff. But instead, we'll be sharing with you some of the memories I have of the exhibit itself, my lifelong fascination with Star Wars, and some of the things that were just sort of going through my mind during this exhibit. I'm also going to be reading off some of the things that were printed on the walls throughout the exhibit that sort of gave a little insight into the types of things that people visiting would be looking at. Here's one now. The on-off action of this glass is a reminder that the objects you will see in this exhibit were originally fabricated for use in motion pictures and intended to be seen only for the briefest of instants. Like the films themselves, these cases preserve a bit of Darth and Yoda's ephemeral magic. And I think that's actually a really good way to start the exhibit. It's almost a setup. They're sort of level-setting expectations in that the stuff you're going to see might not look as good in front of you when you're 2 inches away from it as it did on screen, or how you imagined it would look on screen. Now for me, I had already worked in the film industry at this point, so I was kind of already aware of how things, like hand props or even costumes that looked great on screen, when you had a chance to sort of play around with them in your hands, they didn't always look as great as they did on screen. The exhibit starts out pretty darn strong. You sort of walk through that main gate with Yoda and Darth, and you're immediately greeted by Han Solo and Carbonite, which even at this age, which was 21 years ago today, was something that still really fascinated me. One of those really iconic pieces from the trilogy that I always wanted to get a hold of and get a close look at, and then here it was right in front of me. So it started off with a pretty darn big bang, and it's funny watching the footage of this because it really snaps me back to that day we spent up in San Francisco, and I remember trying to capture so much of what I was seeing. I'm going to read to you the text on that wall because it went by pretty fast. Storyboards are a series of illustrations that tell the action of the script in pictures. They're used to develop the visual feeling that scenes are intended to have. Usually only action or special effects sequences are storyboarded. Alex Tavolaris. Storyboards. Early draft of opening scenes for Star Wars. This sequence includes a segment wherein action takes place on the planet Alderaan. This segment was not included in the final version. Note the similarity between Alderaan and Cloud City. When I look at this from an editor's perspective, I realize that if I had the chance to go back and do it today, I would shoot it much differently. What's interesting about the video you're watching is that it actually consists of 2 separate passes through the museum. The first time I went through, I was very focused on getting close-ups of stuff. And afterward, it occurred to me that I didn't really get any establishing shots. There were no passes across the different rooms to sort of set the feeling of the room or show the scope of it or the number of people who were there, to kind of give the impression of just how important this exhibit was, not only to me, but also to everyone there. And I think that's one thing that is really lost on someone who may be looking at this today, who wasn't in their 20s in 1994, where we were in a time where these types of artifacts just weren't available for public consumption. In fact, I'll need to fact check, but I feel very certain that this was the first exhibit in America of these types of Lucas archive pieces. If I remember correctly, it had previously done a brief stint in Japan and then moved to San Francisco. And at the time, my mind was just absolutely blown knowing that I could go and see these artifacts from the creation of three of my favorite movies of all time. So, of course, I rushed to San Francisco. I was living in Orange County at the time, flew up there for a day trip, and was not disappointed. But I think the context here is that at the time, these things were not available anywhere else. There were no tours. You couldn't go to a Star Wars exhibit that happened to be passing through town or a convention that happened to have a chunk of stuff in it. This was it. This was the first time. This was the only time. And there were threats that this would only be a one-time engagement. And once it left Yerba Buena Gardens, it wasn't coming back. So seeing these things firsthand was quite a spectacular experience. Prior to this, the only place you could see things like this were in books like The Art of Star Wars, The Art of Empire Strikes Back, The Art of Return of the Jedi. And that actually brings me to my first story I want to tell. I was a young lad, and I received as a Christmas gift The Art of Return of the Jedi. It was a hardcover book. And prior to that, I'd just been a fan of the movies. I, of course, collected all the toys, the action figures, the ships, all that. But seeing this book really gave me a glimpse into what went into the filmmaking process. And so my introduction to those types of things led to this type of room. I remember this room was particularly mind-blowing because this had so many of the iconic ships that were seen in the trilogies. This matte painting right here, I had actually studied in that book, The Art of Return of the Jedi. And I remember hearing about the smiley-faced stormtrooper. And I had watched all those documentaries. In fact, I'd consumed ravenously any documentary that aired or any special that came out that showed behind the scenes and how these movies were made. And of course, it all came back to these artifacts that were created to bring that vision to life. One of the challenges in editing this project is trying to show this particular room, and also the other rooms to a lesser degree, in a linear fashion. Because my brother and I were sort of being bumped all around the room, it was hard to sort of capture one piece at a time. I also wanted to capture each miniature or painting from different angles. So what I ended up doing is, I'd start in one corner of the room and shoot a bunch of stuff, then I'd move to a different location and go back and shoot those same pieces again. What this led to in my final footage was a very spread out approach to each of these pieces. So I'd have to go to one part to grab a shot of a TIE fighter, for example. Then I'd go forward 5 minutes and I'd have another angle of that TIE fighter. And the way I decided to present this video is to try to make it a very linear journey through the room. So we start with one particular ship, and you'll see I have a bunch of different angles, but those different angles were taken during different parts of my tour. So it was rough. What I'd like to do now is read to you one of the pieces of writing that was on the wall in one of the main halls, and it sort of helps to set the tone for the larger experience. The Art of Star Wars. When attempting to understand American culture in all its complexity and richness, we should include areas of production beyond the traditional confines of the fine arts. Particularly important for this century, we should look at Hollywood film for the way it can manifest the fantasies, values, and tensions of the country. With this in mind, the Center presents the Art of Star Wars in order to explore both the content and the boundaries that define contemporary American visual culture. We offer these objects and paintings not to equate them with art, but to suggest that arguing the point may no longer be important. It may be enough to say that these objects are worthy in themselves for us to visit now. In these last years of the century, we take this opportunity, at a distance of almost 20 years, to review the milestone that was Star Wars. We use the same analytical tools we would employ in similar retrospective projects. We explore those questions that may further explain the importance of these films. What were the intentions of the makers, and what were their assumptions about reality? How were these objects originally consumed, and how did we see them today? What did we bring to our understanding of them, and how are our personal biases impacted by our own social status and the larger society's conditions? The Star Wars trilogy had a huge impact on its audience. No one had ever experienced a science fiction film with its energy, wit, production values, and visual imagination. Star Wars is an example of how visual experience is capable of moving many people. One can also argue that the impact of Star Wars is largely due to its wide array of powerful sources. Threads of Buddhist philosophy, as well as the ideas of mystical writers like Carlos Castaneda, inform the Star Wars trilogy. Much of the costumes derive from religious gowns and military uniforms of pre-industrial Japan. The narrative plot resonates with Faustian drama in which the hero is tempted to sell his soul. Additionally, Star Wars reflects and influences our reality by participating in the debate over values and meaning in a diverse and dynamic society. In its time, Star Wars was at the forefront of technological innovation. It was one of the first films to truly exploit the possibilities of computer-generated filmmaking. Ironically, the items on display are themselves now victims of technological advance. The next Star Wars trilogy will not use such models or paintings to any significant extent. Rather, the new films will be created almost entirely on computers. High technology has rendered the objects in the art of Star Wars relics of film past, anachronisms from the 70s, and thus made them even more historically significant. When I was originally recording this footage, I captured a lot of the writing on the walls. There were different quotes in different rooms, sometimes from other movies, sometimes from philosophers, sometimes from books. And after reading that first one out loud, it really smacks of pretentious claptrap. I'll be blunt. I'm not super impressed by the text. It's attempting to make what to me was a fun experience into something far more cerebral and academic than I think it needs to be. So I made a choice not to include the other writings that were shown throughout the exhibit, and frankly, I think the video is better because of it. I would argue that it frees the viewer to enjoy the experience rather than listen to a bunch of pretentious nonsense about how we're supposed to examine this, when I think it should really be up to the viewer to decide how to consume this. That said, if you have the Star Wars soundtrack handy, I recommend just putting that on, muting my voiceover, and enjoying that. I originally had the idea of running soundtrack music underneath my voiceover, but then I realized that would constitute a copyright violation, and I certainly didn't want to do that and induce the wrath and ire of Lucasfilm, who otherwise has given us so much. I think another little interesting piece of contextual data that might make this story more interesting is the understanding that this was a very dark time for Star Wars fandom. In fact, if anything, I would say right around the time of this exhibit is we were really just emerging from the cave. After the original trilogy came out and sort of faded from the public eye, it was a bad time to be a fan. Not only was there not a lot of merchandise being generated anymore, I remember very specifically when the Kenner line was canceled. They had a line of toys planned beyond the Ewok and droids lines. It was supposed to be some sort of fantasy line. It was like, here's things that weren't on screen, but could have happened right off to the side. Sort of Shadows of the Empire type stuff, where the Kenner team was going to fire up the creative juices and design their own characters and ships and storylines and whatever. But it never materialized, and I remember when the comic book series ended with issue 107. I was very sad because it sort of signified to me the end of America's love affair with Star Wars, if not the global love affair with Star Wars. And it never really ended mine. Just because everyone else wasn't into it doesn't mean I had stopped really enjoying it. So it was a dark time, and there were many years that went by that there was no new material. And it wasn't until Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire novels came out that I think really reignited the franchise. And at the time, I remember everyone was saying, oh, these are, this is supposed to be the next trilogy. Lucas has endorsed them, so this is it. He approves of this storyline. And I was always very skeptical of that. As you saw from one of the things I read earlier, it was already afoot that there was a new trilogy in production that was going to come out. Pre-production had started. Maybe it was just an idea at this time. I don't remember. But there was this big long period that seemed like forever as a kid where it wasn't cool to be a Star Wars fan. And what's interesting is you flash forward to today, especially with Disney now making the movies, and with the recent movie that was just in theaters. It's a great time to be a Star Wars fan right now. There's never been a broader variety of merchandise, of comic books, of novels, customizable card game. There's just everything. There's a tabletop game. Everything is Star Wars. There's Star Wars Band-Aids. Man, if you want something Star Wars, you can have it. And that was most certainly not always the case. So there's a little history lesson for you. Going back to one of the things I said earlier about how at this time there was no other exhibit, no one had seen this stuff. It's amazing how much has changed since then. I now have dozens of friends who have visited the Lucasfilm archive, who have photographed many of these ships, who have developed products based on many of the ships, of the costumes, of the props. And at this time, these things had never been seen in public before. And I look at the footage that I captured and I think, man, why did I not get more when we get to the props room? Why was I not more obsessed? It's very interesting in hindsight. One of the highlights of the model room was, of course, the model of the Millennium Falcon. This is the large model, which I believe was used in A New Hope, and a smaller one was created for the later movies. I'm not the historian of the various models that were seen throughout the trilogy, so I may be wrong on that. However, seeing this miniature in person was another one of those really groundbreaking things. The Falcon was my favorite ship as a child. I had the toy. I went on many adventures with Luke and Han and Chewbacca and the droids in that ship. It saw a lot of damage in the backyard, be it in the pool, in the sandbox, out in the snow, whatever. And seeing this here in front of me, just having it right in front of my face, was just absolutely spellbinding. Seeing all the detail firsthand, all the weathering, all the battle damage, all the little nurnies that go into its creation. Knowing that years later, friends of mine would participate in creating a reproduction, not of this one, but of the next one down, where they got to view the model and touch it and measure it, and just crazy. And I remember filming this at the time, and I was so excited to document so many of the different pieces, hoping that it would be of value to someone as a piece of reference. I guess the debate is still out in my mind. Has the ship been better documented for the public? I know of the people who have had access to the Lucasfilm archives have no doubt crawled over it with a micrometer and a digital camera and a scanner and gotten every square inch documented. But that type of stuff isn't really publicly available, so I can't really say for sure. Either way, at the time, it was absolutely fascinating. See all the little flashlight stuff? That was my brother Chris. After visiting the exhibit a couple times, I realized that a lot of the things couldn't really be seen very well, either, as you can see with the Falcon, because of the lighting or just the way the exhibit was set up. So I had my little brother bring a flashlight with him, and then when we would get to particularly hard to see parts, he would shine it up in there so I could get some good footage. I definitely don't feel like I got exhaustive coverage of it, mainly because the crowds were pushing and there was security was always keeping the crowds moving, and I kept getting yelled at for putting my camera over the plexiglass, which in hindsight was the right thing to do. I mean, the yelling at me part, because I can't even imagine what would happen if I were to drop my camera and it crashed on top of the Falcon and did some damage to it. Jeez. But I guess at the time I was so dedicated to my documentarian lifestyle that I put aside any concerns for the material itself. I'd like to take a minute to set the Wayback Machine to when I was about 6 years old. My family had just moved to America. I'm not an American citizen. I'm actually from New Zealand, even though my accent has obviously faded over time. And as young kids in grade school tend to do, you get invited to birthday parties. I was invited to one by a gentleman named Tom Eisman. And at this birthday party, there was a magician. I remember he made a rabbit appear from fire. He had this little lock box that could make stuff disappear. And what's interesting about the party is when you leave, you get a goodie bag. And in my goodie bag, I received a carded R2-D2 action figure. And at the time, I had no idea what it was. I didn't know what Star Wars was. I didn't know who R2-D2 was. But I thought it was the coolest thing I had ever seen. And I remember going to my parents and saying, what is this Star Wars? What is this little guy? Is it a robot? Is it a tank? Is it a person? I just don't understand. I have to know more. So we went down to the Woodfield Mall where Star Wars was playing in theaters. Today, when a movie is in the theaters, it's in for like 4 weeks and then it's out because it needs to come out on Blu-ray a couple months later. But back then, movies would be in a theater for a year or maybe 2, or they would just keep showing it. If there was money to be made, this movie would be shown again and again. I don't remember how long it was after the initial release of the movie, but we went to see Star Wars and we were late. And I remember so clearly coming into the theater, there were these double doors. We pushed through the doors, and the very first thing I saw was that scene in the opening when the escape pod is ejected from the side of the blockade runner that had R2-D2 and C-3PO in it. So it's a shot from inside the tunnel where you see the thing leave. And I was hooked. That was it, man. From that moment, I was all in on Star Wars. And so tying this back to what we're looking at now, if you go back a few minutes, they actually had that escape pod on display in this particular room. I didn't learn until years later that that escape pod was actually constructed out of 2 cardboard mixing buckets that were glued opening to opening and then just decorated with a bunch of model parts using a technique called kit bashing. If you look at many of the models, I want to go ahead and say all of the models in this particular room, they all incorporate an element of kit bashing. So what would happen is you would go to your local hobby store and pick up a bunch of model kits, like a Panzer tank or an aircraft or whatever, and you'd bring it back to the workshop and you'd find all the little interesting nondescript bits, like pieces off the engine or little guns or whatever, and you would use those as surface detail just to break up the monotony of a particular shape. So that particular escape pod, if you go back and look at it, you can totally see how it's just 2 buckets stuck end to end and then a bunch of little decorative pieces put on. They got a few engines, which they may have gotten from like a rocket model kit or something like that. And it's just amazing the creativity that went into those models that were made back in the day by the ILM film crew. And even to this day, a number of my friends are notoriously famous kit bashers, and there is a whole hobby that has erected itself around identifying all the different pieces that go into the making of a particular Star Wars ship, or from any other movie, whatever. And it's interesting, I remember there was a time where I was pursuing a project from a different movie that had some kit bash elements into it. And man, I took like one look at it and I was just like, my brain is not good enough. It just doesn't work that way. Like I can't sort of look at a piece and identify it from a plastic tree, which I may have looked at 2 years ago. It's great though, there's whole websites that have come together that have scans of all the different trees of model parts. It's an absolutely fascinating hobby that requires an extreme level of attention to detail, knowledge, memory. Just absolutely fascinating. As luck would have it, my fascination for R2-D2 actually continued through my adult life. I remember as a child, a friend of mine named Jared Galasian, he and his father had hatched a plot to build me a replica of a life-size R2-D2 for one of my birthdays. I think this would have been around the time Jedi was coming out, and they were going to make it out of an oil drum or something. And I think at the time there was even the notion that I might be able to fit inside of it, because I was, after all, a little kid. And that was really, as far as I can tell, the first instance in my memory where it occurred to me that I might be able to have in my hand something from the Star Wars universe. It wasn't necessarily directly from it, but it was more than an action figure or a toy. It was something life-size. It was a replica. And that also happened to launch another lifelong passion of mine, which is prop making, or replica prop making in the case of Star Wars, and also robotics. The very first prop replica I ever made was Luke Skywalker's lightsaber from Return of the Jedi. I remember after Return of the Jedi had come out, I wanted one of those lightsabers so bad, but at the time I had no idea what it was. So I took a wooden dowel rod that I found in the garage, and I used some green Tester's model paint to paint the blade, or what would have been the blade. I then took some silver paint and painted a handle, and then I even took some red and green paint and made a couple buttons on what was the hilt. And that actually gave me many, many hours of fun and adventure and satisfaction out in the backyard. Back to the R2-D2 story. So I had it in my head that R2-D2 was something I wanted. Many years later, once the internet had sort of come alive, I started researching it. I would say this was around 1998, so a few years after this video. There was a magazine article about a man who had built one using some kind of sonotube, and he had some sort of weird shaped dome. And I remember seeing the pictures and I was like, it just doesn't look quite right. It wasn't to the degree of accuracy that I was interested in. It sort of looked malformed, almost like it was in like a carnival mirror or something. And I did a little more searching and didn't really find enough information about the hobby that I felt I could pursue it with the degree of satisfaction I was hoping to get out of it. So I put it back on the shelf. A few years later, there was a Yahoo group, the R2-D2 Builders Club. I think this was like the next level after a listserv group, where it was basically just a bunch of people sending group emails back and forth. And there would be an archive, and you could go read the archives and read through other people's emails. And man, in hindsight, it was horribly messy. But back in the day, that was the source for information. At the time, the big thing is people had gotten what they believed to be good measurements of an R2-D2, and people were producing parts. People with machine shops were outputting very accurate aluminum pieces. People with the right kind of machinery were producing accurate shaped domes that were laser cut or water jet cut. And this was amazing. The downside to it is you needed a great deal of time to invest in acquiring these parts. Because what had happened is one guy would announce that he's doing a run of, say, coin slots. And you would sign up for it and you'd pay for it. And then 6 months later, the part would come out. And then some other guy would say, hey, I'm doing a run of feet. So you can get a set of metal feet. So give me some money in 6 months. And so you had a few people who were working to sort of get these pieces out to people. But the wait time was just exhausting. And I knew it wasn't for me. I knew I just didn't have the patience to sort of sign up for these runs, cross my fingers, hope that it didn't go south, hope that the money I sent them would be refunded if it did or something like that. And so again, I just put it on the shelf because I knew I didn't have the stomach for that. But I always stayed connected to the R2 Builders community. And then one day, shortly after I had returned to America after living abroad for a couple of years, a gentleman on the R2-D2 Builders Club, which I think had migrated to astromech.net by then, was offering up his parts kit for sale. So he was the one who had just spent a couple of years acquiring parts and had gotten to a point, for whatever reason, that he didn't want to continue with his build. So I, of course, immediately grabbed up all those parts. I realized that the dream of owning my own R2-D2 was finally at hand. So I grabbed all those parts, and then shortly after that moved to San Francisco, where, interestingly enough, this exhibit had taken place, and set up a workshop to build my R2-D2. I actually banged him out in record time. I finished mine in about 3 months, which is wild for the R2-D2 Builders Club. It just takes a lot of time to build an R2-D2. There's a lot of resources, a lot of knowledge, a lot of skills that you have to learn to get it done right. And fortunately, much of them I already acquired through other projects. So cranking out an R2-D2 didn't take too long, and I was absolutely thrilled when he was done. Took him to a few events, got to show him off to some friends, and now he sits in my living room, and honestly is one of the greatest accomplishments of my semi-adult life. At about this point in the tour, I'm mostly done with the main model room that I'm in right now. And I think one of the things that was also really interesting about this exhibit is that it wasn't just miniatures and costumes. It really was production artwork like what we're looking at right now. It was the conceptual work that people like Ralph McQuarrie had done to help George Lucas visualize what it was going to look like when it hit the screen. Now I'm in the next room, which is really sort of a props and weapons room, a lot of great conceptual artwork. And it's interesting comparing this type of work with the stuff that like Doug Chiang did on the prequels and how much more sophisticated the designs have gotten over time. What's also really interesting looking back is finding out how primitive the props were that were made for the movies. Since this video was filmed, much has changed in the hobby of prop replicas, and a lot of research has been done and a lot of knowledge has been shared. And one of the things that keeps cropping up is that so much of what appeared in Star Wars was based on found items. So when we look particularly at something as iconic as Luke Skywalker's lightsaber or Han Solo's blaster, what we find are not pieces of creative genius, but opportunities to save budget money. We learned years later, for example, that the Han Solo blaster was actually repurposed from, I think it was a Frank Sinatra movie. Like they just rented the gun, added on a few things, added on a scope. I don't remember the whole history of it, though that particularly right there is not the A New Hope blaster. But many found items were used. So for example, the Darth Vader lightsaber and also the Luke Skywalker lightsaber from the first film were flash gun handles. So if you can think of those old cameras that in old movies a bunch of photographers would be standing around snapping pictures with that big circular thing with the bulb behind it, the thing that held that bulb was a lightsaber. Very little was changed. They added some grips, they added a little D-ring on the bottom, but really that was it for the lightsaber. These Stormtrooper blasters, the Rebel Trooper blasters, were Sterling machine guns that had some pieces added onto them to make them look futuristic and interesting. I guess it's just really interesting to learn that so many things that seemed so iconic at the time were rather mundane and just changed around a little bit. Another very interesting takeaway from this exhibit was learning just how much of a recycler George was. And I'm sure, much like the props being made out of found items, much of that was due to budgetary constraints. Or maybe he just had an idea that Ralph McQuarrie or someone realized that didn't make it into one particular movie, so it was repurposed for another one. A great example of that is the storyboards we saw earlier, where they showed at the very end what was supposed to be Alderaan, but obviously that was repurposed into Bespin for The Empire Strikes Back. It was also very interesting, if you have a chance to go back, the TIE fighter that you saw in that storyboard actually matched the prototype TIE fighter that showed up in that model room. So it's just really interesting how it all sort of fits together and how something that didn't work in one place was maybe moved over to another part of the movie or repurposed somewhere else. I guess at the time George didn't have the type of budget that he had for the prequels where if he would imagine it, it would be made into real life, it would be realized. That also brings up another interesting point, which was actually made in that super pretentious text blurb I read earlier about how the prequel trilogy was intended to be made entirely in the computer and whatnot. And I guess that was a little bit too far forward looking at the time, because as it turned out, the prequels relied heavily on miniatures and very traditional storytelling techniques. But I think what happened is they were so overridden by all of the CGI and the oversaturation, the overuse of CGI, that it got lost in the mix. But that's not to say that practical models, miniatures, props didn't find their way into the prequels. I guess there just isn't as much remaining afterward to show off. And of course, based on the story I told earlier, I'm sure you can imagine how excited I was to come upon R2-D2. I cannot say for certain in hindsight whether that was a screen-used droid or a promotional droid or one that was made after the fact. I didn't really get enough detailed footage of it, and also at the time I wasn't as familiar with the details of what one of the screen-used R2s would look like. So I can't say for sure. Another interesting element of this exhibit, which I wanted to share, is one that wouldn't be obvious to someone watching this video. At the time of this exhibit, the internet wasn't really a big thing. Of course, the DARPA instance of it existed, but you couldn't just go online and sort of Google the art of Star Wars and see pictures from the exhibit, have it walk you through all the rooms, or even see videos on YouTube. So each time I walked into a new room, it was like a world of miracles opening up before me. The land speeder is another one of those iconic pieces from my childhood. As a child, I had the land speeder toy, and I would put Luke and Ben in the seats. and I'd put C-3PO and R2-D2 behind them, and then I'd drive it all over the living room floor and all that great stuff. So really just seeing it in front of me, oh man, it was just so mind-blowing. And not only was it great to see the actual vehicle from the movie, but it was also just so surprising. I just didn't see it coming, as with all the stuff in this room. A lot of the artwork that we see on the walls was also very familiar to me from my childhood. Either it was artwork that had appeared in The Art of Return of the Jedi, or more prominently, it had shown up in different Topps trading cards over the years. I, of course, was a huge fan of collecting trading cards when that was a thing. And one of the things that made it so interesting was that you didn't have a DVD or you didn't have a Blu-ray or a VHS of the movie that you could just watch and just sort of check out different scenes and different props and different vehicles and weapons. You had to get trading cards. So seeing a lot of the artwork in these different rooms, artwork that appeared on trading cards or in press kits or books or magazines, was really interesting to me because these were the originals. These were paintings done by Ralph McQuarrie or sketches or drawings or whatever, and it was just fantastic. That actually reminds me of another little story from my childhood that I think might be interesting, mainly because it's just sort of odd as it points out how things have changed so drastically. I remember back in the day, we had one friend out of my entire school whose family owned a VCR. Actually had a VHS machine. And this was before they were common. Like our school library had one, but for most of the time we were just watching like 16 millimeter films. So I had this one friend, his name was David Jenkins, and his family had a VCR. And even better, or even worse, they had two of them. So what they would do is they would acquire movies. I guess even back then you could rent them. They would rent movies and then make copies for themselves. So one day I was hanging out with David Jenkins at his house, and he said, "Hey, do you want to watch a movie?" I said, "Sure," because at the time, that was a very novel idea. You sort of had one option, and it was to watch TV. You could watch UHF or VHF. There weren't that many channels. You probably had an antenna on the roof. But the idea of sort of watching a movie when you decided you want to watch it was a very foreign concept. Even more foreign was that someone would have in their house a copy of Star Wars. And to someone watching this video today, that must sound utterly absurd. But that's how it was, ladies and gentlemen. There was no VHS Betamax available. They were super expensive machines, and even movies themselves, they sold for like $90. I remember when Empire Strikes Back was released on VHS, it was $90. They had this thing called sell-through price. And the idea was if you wanted to buy the video, you had to pay this crazy high price, which would allow rental places the opportunity to generate revenue for a few months from renting them for $2 or $3 a piece or whatever it was. So if you wanted to own one of these, you had to just be completely rich, crazy rich. So anyway, David Jenkins says to me, "Do you want to watch Star Wars?" And I lost my mind. I was so excited. I called my parents to tell them I was about to watch Star Wars on TV, and they had no idea what I was talking about. It made no sense to them because back in those days, if you wanted to see Star Wars, you had to go to the theater. The Tauntauns on display at this exhibit also have a very special place in my heart. Not only did the Tauntauns introduce me to the concept of stop-motion video making, but I also learned about the masterful artwork of Mr. Phil Tippett, who in my mind is one of the pioneers of turning stop motion into contemporary storytelling. Now, of course, stop motion isn't anything new, and you need look no further than people like Ray Harryhausen, who were genuine pioneers of the art form, to see some of the spectacular work they've done. I highly recommend researching that further. But seeing Phil Tippett actually make that Tauntaun come to life one frame at a time was a real eye-opener for me, and it actually led me to produce the very first film I ever made, which was shot on an 8mm camera, and it was, not surprisingly, a stop-motion movie made using Star Wars action figures. One of the next big reveals of the exhibit was this costume room. And even now, looking back at it, they had some great iconic costumes in there, but so many of them are missing. Like, where's Luke's Tatooine outfit? I would have loved to see that. And also, I think the way they displayed them didn't really lend itself well to being able to get a good look at the costumes. Of course, the ones on the first row, you could get up close to them, you could zoom in on them, like I'm doing in some of these shots, but the ones that were on the other two rows proved difficult to get footage of. Please keep in mind that at this time, these costumes just weren't really available for public viewing. So I felt like the footage I was getting and the photos I was taking were sort of the first time a fan such as myself had had the opportunity to document them at the level of detail I was trying to do. In fact, just looking at it now, like that slave Leia outfit, if I had had this video and maybe some more detailed photos of it back in the day, I'm sure that would have revolutionized some of the many costumes that you see out there today. There's also some great footage of the Han Solo belt and accessories, which again just weren't really readily available at the time. Back to the topic of filmmaking, this room actually proved particularly challenging because of the way the crowd was moving, and because in the video, the way I wanted to display the costumes was linearly from left to right, bottom to top. It proved to be an editing challenge. The footage was sort of spread out all across the room. Like as I came in through the front door of this particular room, I shot a couple establishing shots that I think help sell the space of the room pretty well. And then I actually had to bounce around inside the room to get decent shots of each costume. I also mentioned earlier at the beginning of the film that I actually made 2 passes through the exhibit. So some of these are from my first pass and some of them are from my second pass. So it was a true editing challenge, which I think not only tested my skills as an editor, but also came together really well. Another one of my favorite Star Wars childhood stories I like to tell revolves around an encounter with Mark Hamill, who of course played Luke Skywalker. And like so many of the stories I've told during this video, the context of it is extremely important. Back in the day, 20 or 30 years ago, the notion of being able to go to a convention and meet a celebrity of your choice, pay them a few bucks and get a picture with them, get an autograph, maybe even have a few seconds to chat with them and say hi, tell them how much you appreciate your work. It just wasn't a thing. If you wanted to meet a celebrity, you had one option, and it was really dumb luck. So flash forward to a comic book convention I was attending at the old Ambassador Hotel, which has actually been demolished since. It was just down the street from the Wiltern Theater, if you know the area. And I was shopping around for comics. I think I was at the time looking for a couple issues from the Long Shot miniseries that I was missing. And sure enough, I saw Mark Hamill pass by. And at the time, I of course was much younger, a little bit shorter. And even then it struck me that Mark Hamill is not a very tall gentleman. But I was super nervous and super out of sorts and did not have the courage to approach him to say hello. And I sort of went over to my father, who was accompanying me, and said, "Oh my God, it's Luke Skywalker." And he said, "You have to go get his autograph." And I happened to have an issue of Star Wars, the comic book series that I had just purchased to also fill a hole in my collection. And so I took it up to him, and he happened to have a pen with him, and I said, "Can you please sign this?" That was the best I could come up with at the time. And he did. He signed to Matt, forcefully, Mark Hamill. At that time, I guess I just had a very different view of the notion of celebrity and actors, and that it was sort of a very rare treat to meet them, which at the time it really was, to be fair. Like meeting Mark Hamill today just wouldn't be that problematic. I could either go to a convention and pay a few bucks to meet him. I could call one of my friends and probably have him organize a meeting. I have friends that work with him on his current show. So it's just really fascinating the way things have changed over time and how much more approachable people like Mark Hamill have become over the years. The conclusion of the Mark Hamill story brings us into the next room in the exhibit, which really focused on masks and maquettes. And of course, we start with the infamous Vader reveal helmet, which I didn't learn until years later involves a bunch of orthodontic components, or maybe it's dental components? Not really sure. I remember how fast this went by on the screen, and even then I was absolutely fascinated by it. I mean, remember that first moment when Luke takes off Vader's helmet, there's a person under there? Whoa, I did not see that coming! All these aliens that were on Jabba's sail barge were also ones that I had become very familiar with, either through the action figures or through the different documentaries that showed how they were made or how they staged the different sail barge scenes, either internal or external. I remember seeing a great picture of one of them. I think it was Reeves, who you don't see in this room except for in maquette form, and he had a hairdryer in his mouth. I guess it was sort of hot on set, and they couldn't have the actors putting on the masks and taking them off in between each take because it was just slow things down so much. And of course, it wouldn't be on hot, it would just be circulating air through it, and that's how they would keep them cool. Speaking of Darth Vader, this actually reminds me of another story from my childhood, and it was another one of those ones that, of course, like the others, depends heavily on context. At the time, we had a store called Venture in Chicago, which was very much like Target. And at the time, I was a big action figure hound, and my mom had to drive me to the stores to search for them. And we learned that Darth Vader would be making an appearance at the local Venture store. So we packed up, headed down there, and it was great. There was like a line going back and forth like at Disneyland. I guess that was a little bit forward looking. You know, they had the velvet ropes, and you would zigzag back and forth, and you'd get up the front, and you could meet Darth Vader. And I actually still have some pictures from that encounter, and looking back, it's just amazing how low budget the costume is. I think he was wearing a Don Post mask. The cape looked kind of satiny. I went up to get my picture taken with him, and I was standing in front of him like my back was facing him. And as I was waiting for my mom to take the picture, he reached around with his cape and sort of enveloped me in it and pulled me in, and he crushed my head against his chest plate. And I remember at the time I was super excited to be like that close to Darth Vader. And I don't think I quite understood that it was just a person who wasn't in the movie who was there. I never thought Darth Vader was a robot. I sort of, even as a child, understood that it was an actor inside. But I didn't understand that it wasn't the person from the movie who was Adventure. I also remember the kid in line in front of me went absolutely bonkers. Like, he ran away screaming when he saw Darth Vader, and it was his turn to get his picture taken. So that was pretty exciting. The maquettes also really fascinate me. You can see how some of them were translated directly into characters that did appear in the movie, and others weren't. There's a guy standing next to the Rancor wearing a purple robe, and that was originally designed for Bib Fortuna. It obviously didn't go with that design. A lot of the maquettes you'll see were designed to be a particular creature, but ended up being a different creature. Like some of the early Jabba the Hutt maquettes ended up just being miscellaneous aliens that appeared throughout the film. Once we leave the mask and maquettes room, we come into another room where the centerpiece is the Max Rebo band. Now, why isn't it the Cy Snoodles band? Or the Droopy McCool band? Why does Max Rebo get to claim the name of the band? Those are great costumes to see in person, or I don't know if costume is the right word for Cy Snoodles since it's more of a puppet. But it was very interesting to see how well they had kept up over time and to get that close to them. Seeing the Gamorrean Guard here actually reminded me of a Return of the Jedi themed story, which sort of ties back to a story I told earlier. Growing up without the internet, we had to rely on silly things like books. And at the time, what would happen is the novelization for the movie was released prior to the theatrical release of the movie. And a couple things were interesting about that. First is it gave you a chance to get the inside scoop on what was going to happen in the movie. And also, the novelization was often written prior to the final cut being made on the movie. I didn't realize this until years later, and there would often be stuff in the books that didn't show up in the movie. And I don't just mean like insight into characters and what they were thinking, what they're doing, but actual scenes and dialogue and stuff that just didn't show up. Marvel Comics also did an adaptation. I remember for Empire Strikes Back, Yoda was a very different looking character, and I wonder if that was because he was based off pre-production artwork prior to the actual filming of the Dagobah scenes. Or who knows, maybe Lucas kept Yoda's actual form secret, and so the Marvel artists were forced to just draw based on whatever they could get out of the archives. Kind of like how Blue Snaggletooth, the action figure that was released by Sears, was all wrong. He was the wrong height, he was the wrong color, because Sears had designed the action figure based on a behind-the-scenes black and white photo where I think the character was sitting down, so they just guessed and they got it all wrong. Anyway, my story is, when Return of the Jedi hit theatrical release, I had read the novelization because, well, heck, I wanted to figure it all out before I saw the movie. I guess even back in the day, I was very spoiler addicted. Sure enough, the day to see it comes, and we go to, of course, the Woodfield Mall, which was just a little bit away from my house in Illinois. And I remember I'd never seen anything like this before. There was actually a line going around the entire theater. It was a duplex. There were 2 screens in this building that actually wasn't in the mall. It was kind of off to the side of the mall. They only had 2 screens. Both of them were playing Return of the Jedi. Line around the building. I was in the car with my father, and he said, nope. And then we turned around and went home, and I was really sad. So I didn't get to see Return of the Jedi when I had planned to. I, of course, saw it later in the theater, but not when I wanted to. Similar kind of thing happened with Empire Strikes Back, which, not coincidentally, I had also read the novelization for. And one of my friends mentioned that he had seen it for his birthday, which I think was release weekend. And he told me about how shocking the part where you see Darth Vader's head inside that little meditation chamber was, and the whole audience kind of gasped. And I figured, well, I've seen that coming. I read the book. I know all about it. But then seeing it in the theater with a bunch of people, it really was totally mind-blowing. Not only because at the time, no one was really sure if Darth Vader was a robot, if he was a person, and there was no online discussion, there was no speculation, there was no leak from Lucasfilm, from some insider who happened to know, who was, had all the inside scoop like we have today. So it was all very mysterious, and seeing it play out in real time in front of you was a very exciting feeling. And I feel like a lot of that has disappeared from the movie-going experience today. Now, sure, there are still things that happen in movies where, we did not see that coming, or there's always surprise twists and stuff. But for the most part, if you sort of put some effort into finding out what happens in a movie, you don't really have to turn over that many rocks to have the whole experience spoiled for you. And I use the word spoiled in the context of spoilers, not necessarily ruined, because for many people, like myself when I was younger, being prepared for the movie-going experience and sort of walking in with some a priori knowledge was a good thing. It helped you enjoy it in a different way. So I guess really that's just a different flavor of the experience of things. Seeing the Death Star from Return of the Jedi up close was also a pretty huge thrill, no pun intended. Insert look at the size of that thing joke here at your peril. One of the cool things about the Death Star model is it was very impressive up close. If you remember back to the beginning of the video and the words that were given regarding the tour and how things were sort of meant to only be seen on screen briefly, and my interpretation of that was, so don't be disappointed when it doesn't look that impressive in person. Well, the Jedi Death Star did not disappoint. In fact, if anything, the opposite. It was startling just how much detail was included in it that didn't end up being seen on screen. All those little brass etching pieces, just layer upon layer upon layer of construction-looking material. All the detail on the surface, it's just phenomenal. There's a great backstory about the original Death Star from A New Hope and how it ended up in super collector Gus Lopez's living room, or a foyer, I believe. I recommend researching that via Google for more information. Some great pictures. There's also a Death Star on display at the Sci-Fi Museum in Seattle, which is definitely worth a visit if you're ever in the area. This little room I'm in now, the sort of Death Star room, had some great pieces in it. Not only did it have the Jedi Death Star, it had the reactor core miniature, had some really iconic matte paintings, including, and I showed a close-up of it, the matte painting that includes one of the buildings in San Francisco, part of its iconic skyline. The matte painter also included in there. Of course, it's something you'd never ever see on screen, but when you're standing right up next close to it, you can see it. There's also some great pre-production artwork and some matte paintings in the Death Star room. And after that, we went up this little stairwell that shows up in the video. And then we were on the very last leg of the tour. There were just a couple little things to be seen upstairs, including the Wampa and the Space Slug from Empire. And then the last wall on our way to the gift shop was again filled with production artwork, all those great paintings by Ralph McQuarrie that showed up in all the promotional material, all the different books, all the different trading cards. Really cool to be able to see all those in person, things I'd looked at as a kid so many years ago, now seeing the originals. And what was cool to me is you could get up right next to it and you could see the brush strokes, you could see the little notes that were written in the margins, you could see the brush strokes that went over the margins. You were looking at the piece of art, not the lithograph representation of it that you would find in a magazine or a lobby card or whatnot. This particular piece of McQuarrie artwork, the one we just passed by with the B-Wing fighter featured prominently in the foreground, was of particular interest to me because it hung on my wall as a poster when I was much younger. That was originally given away as part of the Star Wars fan club welcoming kit after it had been Bantha Tracks originally, rebranded as Star Wars Fan Club, and that was sent out as one of the opening membership gifts. A lot of great pre-production sketches of the Wampa. Interesting how small he actually turned out to be. I don't know if the video properly captures how small he was, but that part where the Wampa lunges at Luke in towards camera was just a hand puppet, and it was really small. I mean, it was definitely much smaller than a human head and shoulders, but I guess that's all you really needed to show it on camera. As we head out into the main lobby, which is not coincidentally where we also came in at the beginning at the ground floor, they had another Millennium Falcon hanging from the ceiling. Definitely a smaller one, and man, it just makes me cringe because I think they drilled a couple holes in it to suspend it from the ceiling. Now, maybe I should give them some credit and assume that maybe those holes were already there? Maybe that's not even a production-made Falcon. Maybe that's a fan-made piece. I don't know. Maybe a viewer can let me know based on their expertise and if they happen to recognize that particular model of the Falcon from some other place. A couple of really great and iconic matte paintings out in this hallway from Cloud City, including the part from the lightsaber duel with Luke and Darth, and also just one of the basic establishing shots of Cloud City. I think that's the one where we see Han and Leia kind of mulling about inside. Bunch of great artwork in here showing conceptual stuff. This was probably artwork that was used to help George Lucas pitch the film. It was really neat is seeing the evolution of some of the characters. And interestingly, a lot of these designs I have seen show up in episodes of Clone Wars, especially that big furry-looking proto-Wookiee-looking guy is now one of the main characters in Clone Wars. Again, going back to my claim earlier that so much of the work was recycled. I guess nothing really went to waste. Anytime a drawing was made that wasn't able to be used in one particular movie, Lucas saved it for another movie, or as we see now, it showed up decades later, which I'm sure wasn't by design, but it's really great to see the artistic forces behind the latest incarnations of the saga are still going back to that really great old McQuarrie artwork and taking advantage of it. There's also a couple interesting pieces in there that look like they might have been Emperor's Palace or something. Don't know, never saw those really show up in any of the movies. We are getting very close to the end of the video, and I wanted to thank you for sitting with me to watch through this. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope my rambling and my storytelling was at least marginally interesting and proved more valuable than listening to the on-site ramblings of 20 years younger Matt Munson at the Yerba Buena Gardens and the crowd noise that accompanied it. You can see by this point in the visit I was spending less and less time on each particular piece of artwork and really just trying to get through it at this point. I remember being pretty tired out. It had been a long day. We had already been through the thing once, and the day was running long, and I think we even had a flight we needed to catch. So at this point it was really just a matter of wrapping things up, getting through the gift shop, and heading down that last flight of stairs on our way out to the main entrance and back to Southern California. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the art of Star Wars at the Yerba Buena Gardens in San Francisco, maybe half as much as I did when I was there.